In our last study, we looked at briefly the history of the early church, compressed in a few minutes' time, and particularly looking at the question of why the early church never sat down and defined their theology. And they didn't. They did not have a systematic theology. And the reason for that was they had to put out too many fires, so to speak. There were crises that arose that they had to deal with. The question of what are you going to do with the Gentiles, for instance. The question of how do you survive under the fires of persecution, first from the Jews and then from the Romans. They had problems that resulted from disorder that arose in the congregations because of the severe persecution. And so they had to deal with the immediate crises. It was not until the persecution relaxed after the conversion of Constantine in the 4th century that the Christians had a breathing space. They had time now to stop and reflect on how do you put this all together and make sense of it. And so when the time came in the West, which I will say the West part of the church was more interested in really understanding theology than the East was, which tended to be much more mystical and philosophical. But in the West, they looked to one man to help them because they respected the scholarship and the dedication of this one man, and his name is Augustine. And he was the bishop of a city in North Africa called Hippo. Now, because of the importance of this, the work of Augustine, because of the theology that he provided, which was accepted by the church, and which became the backbone, the keystone, if you please, of Christian theology, we need to spend a little time with him. Now, our study focuses on two men in the 16th century, and we're going to get there eventually. Erasmus of Rotterdam and Martin Luther. And it will focus particularly on an event that took place in the year 1525 when a great controversy arose over the human will. And that was really the culmination of the controversy that had started earlier and had erupted in times past. But it was a defining moment for the Reformation. And it is so important in understanding our salvation that we're going to spend really this whole class looking at that event, the confrontation between Erasmus and Luther. But as a background to that, we need to understand the theology of St. Augustine. Because both Erasmus and Luther were Augustinian monks. One of them took his vow to the Augustinian order quite seriously, and the other used it primarily as a means to have access to libraries. But they both were Augustinians. And throughout the medieval world, where theology was taken very seriously, scholars will, for the most part, accept the theology of Augustine. Now, sometimes they had problems. They differed on some points. But I know of no scholar who came out and said, Augustine is totally wrong. Now, the one person who said that, which we'll talk about tonight, was in the very early period of the Middle Ages, the very late part of the Roman Empire, and the church branded him a heretic. And that brand remained. And even today, the Roman Church will affirm Pelagianism is heresy. And that became a fundamental tenet of the Christian faith, which was absorbed in the Protestant Reformation and continued. But we'll see later that the Protestants became much more committed to the Augustinian position than the Roman Church was. Now we'll put all this together later. This is just trying to get us a feel for where we're going with this. Let me tell you a little about this man. If you have not read the Confessions of Augustine, you should do it. It is one of the most moving books you will ever read. It's 400 pages. We won't try to cover it all tonight. But I would recommend it to you. You'll read it, you can't put it down. It grips your heart to understand this man's journey to faith. This is his own personal spiritual autobiography. You see, this man was born of a spiritually mixed marriage. His mother was a Christian. Her name was Monica. His father was a pagan. Now, in the time of Augustine, it was customary for children who are born into Christian families to be baptized. But if one parent was a pagan, oftentimes that baptism was not performed, and that was the case with Augustine. And if you waited until you were older, in order to be baptized, you had to undergo a 3-year program of teaching, of learning. You're a catechumen for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, you can present yourself as a candidate for baptism. It would believe it's much easier to be baptized as an infant than to go through the 3-year program. Augustine, as a boy, was enrolled in that, and he had pursued it almost to the point of graduation. And he dropped out. He became disinterested. And he came to the conclusion, I'm not interested in Christianity. I don't want to be a Christian. I don't believe in it. He followed his dad's thinking much more than his mother's. His mother was heartbroken that her son had rejected the Lord that she loved. And what his mother Monica did in response to that was to pray. And every day, Monica would take her son before the throne of God in prayer. And she did so with tears. It was an emotional thing. It wasn't just, Father, I hope you'll bring and pray you'll bring my son to faith. She begged and pleaded with God, and she cried and she wept. But years went by, and Augustine did not respond. He had an interest in rhetoric, which is language, which is presenting speeches. And he wanted to teach. We would say today a speech teacher. And so he was pursuing an academic career. Now, religiously, he joined the Manichaean Church. The Manichaean Church was established by a Persian by the name of Mani, M-A-N-I. Mani had mixed elements of a number of religions to create his religion. So we might call it a synthetic religion. It was a mixture. He had mixed elements of Christianity. He had mixed elements of Neoplatonism and his native Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. And the religion that he comes up with, which the church considered to be a heresy, was a religion that was highly what we call dualistic, meaning there's this clear-cut difference between right and wrong, good and evil, light and dark, the physical and the spiritual. Anything physical is evil. The spiritual is good. You know, it's this dualistic viewpoint. And it virtually had a good God and a bad God who were equally matched in power. It's kind of like God casts one vote for you, the devil casts one vote, and you cast the deciding vote. You know, you've got this equally matched gods out here, equal in power, both vying for your soul. Well, for some reason, Manichaeanism was appealing to Augustine, and Christianity was not, and he deliberately chose not to be a Christian, did not want to be a Christian. And as he pursued his course as a speech teacher, and as he pursued his church activities, there were questions that came up. Questions about the origin of good and evil. Questions about the nature of this physical life. Questions about what do you do with your physical desires? Because you see, this young man had very strong physical desires, lusts. He had a mistress. He had this woman he loved, and he had fathered a child. So he had a son. He had almost an uncontrollable sexual appetite. How do we deal with this in this context? And so he had many questions. And he would go to the Manichaeans and ask them. And he had great confidence in them. And as he would go to them, they couldn't answer his questions. And so he finally had the opportunity to talk to the leader, the absolute leader in the Manichaean church. And when he presented his questions to this person, he could not answer them to his satisfaction. He was very disappointed. He really wanted them to answer. He wanted to be a Manichaean. But because they couldn't answer his questions, he became disillusioned with them. So he turned to the Neoplatonists. Now, by this time, Neoplatonism virtually had become a religion. Plato's philosophy had become a religion. It was similar to Manichaeanism, but a little more sophisticated, and they believed in emanations that came from God and levels of reality and levels of truth and all kinds of spiritual beings that are at work out there to help lift your soul up to God. And he got involved with the Neoplatonists. He thought they would answer his questions. And they came, he said, closer to it than the Manichaeans did, but he still had unanswered questions. And then he thought, I'm going to try. I don't want to do this, but I'm going to see what this man Paul has to say. So he began to read the epistles of Paul, and he said, I got the answer to my questions. Paul answered the questions of my heart. He was amazed. But he still did not want to be a Christian. He just wanted answers. Meanwhile, a job opportunity opened up. At the end of our study last week, I mentioned a man named Ambrose. Ambrose was another man who did not want to be a Christian. As a matter of fact, he did everything in the world to avoid being a Christian. And when the people of Milan, who thought he did a brilliant job in defending the truth against the Arian heresy, wanted him to be their bishop, he said, I don't want to be a Christian, forget it. Brought in prostitutes, tried to make a run for it, treated people with great cruelty, just to show them, I'm not a Christian. Don't you get the point? I'm not a Christian. But they still demanded that he be their bishop, and he was baptized, and he became a Christian in his heart through that process. Very sincere. And what we know of Ambrose's theology, it was pretty good. He wrote hymns, but he became the bishop of Milan in North Italy, that big city in North Italy. And an appointment came up. They needed a rhetoric teacher, so to speak, there. And the rhetoric teacher, the assistant, was almost like a secretary. It would help with the writing of letters. And that appointment was received by this young man, even though Augustine, who put in an application for the job, was much younger than other applicants and much less qualified than many of the applicants. There was no good reason for this young man to get that position. He was not the person who deserved it, but it went to him. And so he found himself moving from North Africa, from the city of Tagaste, where he was born in North Africa, to Milan in North Italy. And he took this position. Now, he knew that Ambrose was a great speaker, and he wanted to learn his technique and style, because remember, his job is to be a speech teacher himself. So Ambrose was highly respected, tremendous preacher. He wanted to listen to his style, but he certainly did not want to listen to his message. Because remember, he still is resolved not to be a Christian. I'm going to read from the Confessions and let Augustine speak in his own words. When therefore they of Milan had sent to Rome to the prefect of the city to furnish them with a rhetoric reader for their city, and send him at public expense, I made application. Through those very persons intoxicated with Manichaean vanities, to be freed wherefrom I was to go, neither of us, however, knowing it, that Symmachus, then prefect of the city, would try me by setting me some subject, and so send me. To Milan I came, to Ambrose the bishop, known to the whole world as among the best of men, thy devout servant, whose eloquent discourse did then plentifully dispense unto thy people the flour of thy wheat, the gladness of thy oil, and the sober inebriation of thy wine. To him I was unknowingly led by thee, that by him I might knowingly be led to thee. That man of God received me as a father, and showed me an episcopal kindness on my coming. Thenceforth I began to love him. At first, indeed, not as a teacher of the truth, which I utterly despaired of in thy church, but as a person kind towards myself. And I listened diligently to him, preaching to the people, not with that intent I ought, but, as it were, trying his eloquence, whether it answered the fame thereof, or flowed fuller or lower than was reported. And I hung on his words attentively. But of the matter I was as a careless and scornful looker on, and I was delighted with the sweetness of his discourse, yet in manner less winning and harmonious than that of Faustus. Of the matter, however, there was no comparison, for the one was wandering amid Manichaean delusions, the other teaching salvation most soundly. Faustus was the Manichaean leader. But, listen, salvation is far from sinners, such as I then stood before him, and yet I was drawing nearer, little by little, and unconsciously. For though I took no pains to learn what he spake, but only to learn how he spake, for that empty care alone was left me, despairing of a way open for man to thee. Yet altogether with the words which I would choose, all came also into my mind the things which I would refuse, for I could not separate them. And while I opened my heart to admit how eloquently he spake, there also entered how truly he spake, but this by degrees. And he goes on to say that little by little, he came to believe that the Christian faith was true, intellectually. But he had problems. His hang-up on lust, his propensity to sin. How do you deal with this? And he found himself emotionally unable to surrender to Christ. And from this point on, for quite a while, he went through a terrible process in his own heart and mind. Because now, intellectually at least, he had come to the point that he wanted to be a Christian, but he couldn't embrace it. He lacked the ability to do so. He had a friend by the name of Alypius. He and Alypius had rented an apartment on the outskirts of Milan in a very nice apartment complex. And they were talking, Alypius was also not a Christian, and they were talking about Christianity. And Augustine kept telling Alypius, I don't know why, I can't turn loose and surrender to God. And one day, they walked out into their courtyard in their apartment complex in Milan. And in that courtyard, they sat down, they were talking, they had opened the scriptures. He was reading Paul. He'd read through Paul's writings. And he began to cry. And he began to weep. He began to sob. And he became embarrassed. He was crying so much in front of his friend. He was crying because he couldn't. And he kept saying, why? And he got so embarrassed that he had to walk away from Alypius because he was embarrassing him that he was crying so much. Thus soul sick was I, and tormented, accusing myself much more severely than my wont, rolling and turning me in my chain, till that which were wholly broken, whereby I now was but just, but still was held. And thou, O Lord, pressed upon me in my inward parts by a severe mercy, redoubling the lashes of fear and shame, lest I should again give way, and not bursting the same slight remaining tie, it should recover strength and bind me faster. For I said within myself, be it done now, be it done now. But it couldn't. It couldn't. And he walked away, and he was crying, he was weeping, he was sobbing, but he heard the voice of some children playing a game on the other side of the wall, we'd say out in the alley. And he said, I couldn't tell whether it was a boy or a girl, but I'd never heard children sing. They were singing a little song, a little ditty, you know. And I'd never heard such a song before, never heard such a game. But this song was coming over the wall, and it was saying, Tolelege, tolelege, tolelege. Well, tolelege in Latin means take it up and read. And suddenly he was struck. It's a sign from God. He rushed back to the place where he and Alypius were sitting, found the text that was still open, and put his finger on a text and looked at it. Now you might say that's not good Bible study. But he did it. And you know what that passage said? It was in Romans chapter 13. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh. No further would I read, nor needed I. For instantly, at the end of this sentence, by a light, as it were, of serenity infused into my heart, all the darkness of doubt vanished away. I want to take you through that experience because it helps you to understand the theology that he puts together. For when he puts it together, it is not only a biblical theology, but it is a personal theology. It is what he has experienced in his own conversion. Now, I should tell you that as you read through the Confessions, a few chapters down from where I was just reading, in his prayer, and all this is a prayer to God, he will say, God, grant what you command, and command what you will. And you can see the nature of that prayer is, God, give me the ability, and then tell me what to do. But up in Britain, there was a monk by the name of Pelagius. And Pelagius was very concerned about grace. And he said, you know, if you teach people grace, and if you're saved by grace, and you're saved forever, and you're not going to lose your salvation, you teach them such a doctrine as that, then they'll abuse it. They'll go out and sin. If you teach them what Paul said, that where sin abounds, grace much more abounds, then they'll go on sinning that grace may abound. Even though Paul said, God forbid. He was very concerned about morality. And he said, if you say that, what you're saying is that there are things that God commands that man cannot do without grace. He said, that's ridiculous. God would never command you to do anything that you cannot do by your own strength and your own wisdom and your own ability. And so Pelagius began to teach that Adam's fall was just affecting Adam. Adam sinned, but when we come into the world totally neutral, with total free will. And that salvation is simply a matter of whether I choose God or whether I don't choose God. And if I choose God and I do the right things and I do the right good works, then I will be saved. And if I don't choose God and I don't do good works, then I won't be saved. And so he devised a doctrine that where grace is not necessary. Grace is okay if you want it, but it's not necessary. And man is totally neutral. And he began to teach this doctrine. And Augustine found out about it. And he said, wait a minute. That is not biblical. And that runs counter to my life and experience. And so there was the first controversy over the will. Now, I need to tell you just a little bit more. Augustine was thinking about this at the same time that he got a request from a man named Marcellinus. Marcellinus was a government official in North Africa. And the Christians were on the hot spot, so to speak. You see, in the year 382, a Christian Roman emperor named Gratian had removed the altar of victory from the Senate house in Rome. That's a pagan altar where you would offer sacrifice. And a senator by the name of Symmachus, who was a pagan, wrote to Gratian and said, Your Majesty, please put the altar back, because if the sacrifices are no longer offered, the gods will curse us and Rome will fall. And if Rome ever falls, it'll be the fault of the Christians. Well, in 410, Rome did fall, was sacked by the Germans. And so the pagans pointed the finger at the Christians, said, you're responsible for this. And Marcellinus said, we need some help. We need you to write a defense that will show that we are not responsible for the fall of Rome. And so that was the excuse for the writing of the work, but it also gave Augustine the opportunity to expand the theology. And the book is called The City of God. And in The City of God, Augustine shows that Rome didn't fall because of the Christians, but because it was the plan and purpose of God, that God had raised up Rome as a city of man, and that the physical always precedes the spiritual, and the city of man precedes the city of God, and it was a foreshadowing of the city of God, and now it was time for Rome to be replaced by the great and wonderful kingdom of Jesus Christ. And then he begins to develop the theology to understand the nature of the city of God, of the kingdom of Christ. It is composed of people who are there not because they have earned it and done good works, but because of the grace of God. Augustine took the biblical Pauline teaching on predestination and applied it in this context and said the only reason that a person has citizenship in the city of God is the divine decree, God's predestining edict. Why? Because man is fallen. The fall has left man irreparably damaged. His will is damaged, and he cannot choose to come to God. Pelagius is wrong. He cannot choose God because of the sin that abides within his will. Let me give you a few quotes quickly from Augustine. Our choices, he did believe in choice. He says, yes, we do make our choices, but our choices fall, he said, within the order of causes which is known for certain to God and is contained in his foreknowledge. Augustine said, you have a God who is all-powerful. You have a God who knows all things. He foreknows all things. Therefore, he foreknows whether you'll be saved or not. And that's going to happen. He cannot foreknow inaccurately. But at the same time, within the scope of his foreknowledge, you make the choices. But he has ordained all the causes in a cause-effect relationship. And your choice is a part of an ordained cause. And so you do make choices, but within the order of causes. Our wills have the power to do all that God wanted them to do and foresaw that they could do. When the will turns from the good and does evil, it does so by the freedom of its own choice. But when it turns from evil and does good, it does so only with the help of God. He could look to his own journey and say, over and over again, if you read the Confessions, God, you brought me here. You know that I struggled against you, and it's only because of you that I am here. You worked in my will. You changed my heart. I wanted to run from you. I didn't want to come to you. And that's why he would make that statement. He says free will got us into a mess. And it is God's omnipotent will that is the only remedy for the mess, for the terrible state that we are in. He said, what the first man became by perversion and penalty, this his descendants are by birth, nature subject to sin and death. Man, corrupt by choice and condemned by justice, has produced a progeny that is both corrupt and condemned. And because this nature has been soiled by sin and doomed to death and justly condemned, no man was to be born in any other condition. Thus, from a bad use of free choice, a sequence of misfortunes conducts the whole human race, excepting those redeemed by the grace of God, from the original canker in its root to the devastation of a second and endless death. But when God invades the heart and changes the will and brings one to faith, then that is eternal life. That is life that is without end. That is life with God, with the omnipotent God, the sovereign God. And so he postulated and he taught a doctrine of salvation by grace that became the foundation of Christian theology. Will it be tampered with and adjusted and revised in years to come? Yes, it will. It wasn't very long until a man named John Cassian came along and said, wait a minute, that's too extreme a statement. Pelagius is extreme and you're extreme. Let's find a compromise, a middle ground. And you have a doctrine called semi-Pelagianism, which began to develop that we can talk about later. But for this point, understand, here in this first great confrontation, you have Pelagius saying the will is totally free, and Augustine saying because of the fall, man lacks the moral ability to come to God, and it must be granted him by an act of God's grace. And in the early church councils, the decision was very clear. Pelagianism is a heresy. And we will turn to the next great confrontation in our next study.